So what happened this January, so just a couple months ago, is the Obama administration came out and said, we have to do a 5-year plan. Under federal law, we're required to look at all of the offshore areas all across the country and decide where we think we should lease for oil and gas. And they said, we're going to keep up business as usual on the West Coast, no drilling. In the Northeast, no drilling. Gulf of Mexico, open for business. Alaska, open for business. The big place there's going to be a change is the Southeast. So this was the news. Really, as folks started looking at it, as folks started writing about it, this is a change in about 30 years of federal policy of keeping the Atlantic and especially the Southeast off limits to oil and gas leasing. So what we have here is a proposal to lease from 50 miles offshore. They've included this proposed buffer, 50 miles offshore out to the edge of the U.S. waters. So you can see that's a huge, huge area, and they said they're going to include that for leasing. Now, what that means...
Yeah, that's going to help the next slide. Here, we have to do this.
There we go. So this, I promise there's not going to be a lot of these, but this is the start of the process. So we are currently where this red circle is up here in the corner. That's the draft proposed program for leasing from 2017 to 2022. Just walking you quickly through this. This is a 5-year program we do up top, then we do specific oil and gas lease sales, then we do exploration plans, and then we do development and production. So if you think of what it takes to get from where we are now to get gasoline in your car, it's a whole lot of steps, it's a whole lot of time, it's a whole lot of process.
How much time?
This could be years. So you have a 5-year program. It's from 2017 to 2022. And what the federal government has done in their recent proposal is said they're going to have a lease sale in that Southeast area in 2021. So a lease sale in the Southeast in 2021. Then they begin exploration drilling. And for those of you who remember the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, that was an exploratory well. That actually wasn't a producing well. It wasn't getting oil and gas out of the earth to put in your cars. Again, it was just looking to see what was out there. This exploration plan area is thought to be one of the riskiest places because there are new areas we haven't gone into before. Did I say question? No. Okay. And then down here, you get development and production. So a couple of things about this slide. It looks complicated. It looks like a long time. It sounds like a long time. But what we know is the longer an area stays in the plan, the harder it is to get out. So what we have right now is an opportunity to say to the federal government, we have a different vision for our coast. We don't want oil and gas leasing. We don't want oil and gas drilling off of our coast. And we can give them all of the reasons why. So going on to the next slide, this is what the federal government is required by federal law to look at. So again, I promise there aren't a lot of these. These are just a couple of slides I actually stole from the federal government's website. These are the factors they have to consider. So when they're going through the process, they have to look at all these ecological characteristics out there, risks and benefits of development, national and regional energy needs, what other uses of the seabed and the marine environment are out there. So this is really important when it comes to fishing, when it comes to renewable energy development. When we think of the other things we want to use our coastal environment and our marine environment for, that goes into it. Potential oil and gas producers come into it. So where the industry wants to go makes a difference. They've been trying to get into North Carolina for quite some time. They have an interest in our area. Laws, goals, and policies of affected states. This one is important too because what's not written there is it is as expressed by the governor. So those 4 states that I pointed out that are being opened up or proposed to be opened up for the first time in 30 years. A big part of the reason they're on the map, a big part of the reason they're up for grabs right now is because the governors of our states have said, we want drilling here. Please come here. Please come to our states. We're open for business. We want you in our backyard. So the Obama administration has said, we're just doing what we were asked to do. If the folks don't like it in these states, they need to speak up. They need to tell their local representatives, their governors, their state representatives, their federal representatives, speak up and make their voices heard that this is not what they want. So again, laws, goals, policies affect the states, and then you keep going down: environmental sensitivity, marine productivity, and environmental information. So big, wonky legal list. This is even a nice boiled down version of it. But basically it comes down to science and politics. We want to boil it all down. That's what we're talking about here, science and politics. So when the Obama administration announced their proposed plan in January, you may have seen something about this. They said, we're going to open up the Southeast for the first time in 30 years. They also said, we're going to take some areas in Alaska, in the Arctic, off the table, because some areas are, quote unquote, too special to drill. So when I heard this, the first thing in my mind that came up was, well, there's a heck of a lot of areas that are too special to drill, and especially in the Southeast. So if you start going through a lot of those features that Rob mentioned at the very beginning, national wildlife refuges, national seashores, bird habitat, fish habitat, all of these areas that are so important for so many reasons, economic, ecological, spiritual, personal, whatever it is, they're out there, and this is the process where we get to weigh in and convey that information to the federal government. So I promise this was the last of sort of the technical slides, but I also felt like I couldn't keep going without a reminder of what's at stake. So I've given a lot of presentations on this topic lately, and it's very easy to have a very heady mental discussion about offshore oil drilling. Do we need it? What are we driving? What's our fuel economy? Should we be doing renewable resources? You can have a lot of theoretical discussions about it, but if you remember what happened in 2010, this was actually, the blowout happened on April 20th, 2010. So we're right on the edge of the 5-year anniversary of the spill. And images like this were widespread at the time. We knew we had birds that were affected by the oil spill. We know we had sea turtles affected by the oil spill. We had the impacts of cleaning up the oil. So when it comes to cleanup of oil spills, there were a number of ways that they were trying to clean up the 200 million gallons that spilled in the Gulf. Some of it was by burning. Some of it was by use of dispersants, which are now being questioned as highly toxic, very harmful to public health as well as the environment. And then you also have this question of the oil that was just left out there, that nobody knows what happened to it. So when they talk about what happened in the Gulf, there's a lot of talk about, well, we cleaned up this much. Again, that cleanup usually had its own environmental cost, but there's also this huge amount of oil out there that they're starting to find is either sitting on the sea floor because the dispersants broke it up and sank it to the bottom, or has affected deep water canyons, deep water corals, fish habitat, all that stuff that's out there in the marine environment that's under the water that we so often don't see. So an important thing to know about this process is that spills like the Deepwater Horizon are considered outliers. It was the biggest oil spill the US has ever seen, it's the biggest oil spill the world has ever seen, and because of that, federal government in most of its environmental documents says, well, we've never seen that before. We saw it once, it's not gonna happen again. They, in general, discount the risk of oil spills overall. So in my mind, when I think about oil drilling, I think about 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill, 1979 Ixtoc oil spill in Mexico, 1989 Exxon Valdez, Deepwater Horizon in 2010. There was another oil spill in the Timor Sea, the Montara oil spill, shortly after Deepwater Horizon. They happen regularly. And they happen in a way that takes generations for these ecosystems to recover. So I feel like all of you know and love the North Carolina coast and are very worried about exactly this type of thing. But again, this is the type of information that needs to be conveyed, that needs to be, the federal government needs to be reminded of. It's not just the daily impacts of oil drilling out there. But that being said, the daily impacts of oil drilling are bad enough. So this is Port Fourchon, Louisiana. And SELC hosted a meeting along with several of our environmental partners over in Chapel Hill in March. And at that meeting, we did two things. We tried to get all the scientists together, so the folks who know about the resources and the impacts of oil spills. And we also brought in people from the Gulf of Mexico. One of our most powerful speakers was a woman by the name of Sin Sartu. She is the executive director of Gulf Restoration Network. And what she talked about is the industrialization of the coast. So even if everything goes perfectly, if no oil is ever spilled, there's never a major disaster, we're talking about fundamental transformation of our coast. So the daily oil spills, those little discharges again that Rob mentioned, oil and water pollution, wetlands loss, again, a transformation of the type of rural, pristine environment that we know in North Carolina and that we really know throughout these southeastern states. So putting this in people's mind and trying to really internalize what's at stake, best case scenario, worst case scenario, and again, this vision of what do we want our coast to look like. So now we move to the pretty pictures. When I think of places that are too special to drill, again, I start going through the list of what we know is out there. These are North Atlantic right whales. There's about 500 of them left in the world. They migrate up and down the East Coast. Their only known calving grounds, again, in the entire world, are in the Southeast United States. And the federal government just proposed about maybe a month ago to expand their critical habitat where it currently exists off of Florida and Georgia all the way up to the southern part of North Carolina. So the scientists out there have said not only do these whales migrate up and down the coast and use all of our waters every single year to transit this space, but this area, again all the way up into North Carolina, is critically important for the survival of the species and those most vulnerable members of the species, the mothers and calves that live there. So we're talking about potentially having oil drilling over the top of these species.
What was the distance from the coast to the the eastern edge of that shaded area?
Yeah, so I don't know the exact distance. This is a proposal right now. So what this is, are you thinking of the buffer? Is that what you're thinking of? Yeah.
Well, there's got to be an overlap.
Right. So there's actually not an overlap with this. The buffer does go further out there. I don't have this confirmed, but my guess is because they didn't want it to overlap directly. I didn't mention this at the time, but my thought on the buffer is the Deepwater Horizon was 50 miles offshore. 50 miles offshore doesn't mean anything to oil. And 50 miles offshore isn't going to mean anything to this area. So if whales are living at the edge of this, and an oil spill happens on the inner edge of this, they could be right smack up against each other.
And seismic can happen outside the 50-mile buffer.
Yes, I'm going to get to seismic as well. Thank you, Brooks. Yes, so exactly. Oil doesn't know boundaries, and seismic, which I'll also talk about, doesn't know boundaries. So more of those pictures that make you go, oh, yeah, right, this is what happens to the coast. This is what makes it so incredibly special. Not only do we have a proposal to expand right whale critical habitat right in this area, but we just had designated sea turtle critical habitat in this area. So the federal government has now recognized a lot of beaches, a lot of offshore area, and look at the coast of North Carolina. This is what I love. Basically, almost the entire area off North Carolina is shaded in some way. That's because it's used extensively by these sea turtles for their breeding habitat, their wintering habitat, and their migratory habitat. So we know that this area all along the southeast, but especially off our coast, is critical to the survival of yet another endangered species. So when I look at these, again, this notion of what's too special to drill, I'm thinking this area, especially off North Carolina, probably is exactly in that category. Brooks mentioned seismic, and that is something that folks may have heard about that is going along with this sort of in parallel right now. So seismic testing is the blasting of air guns in the marine environment to find out where the oil resources are. So the best available information we have about what's under the sea floor in the southeast is that our 4 states have, I believe it's 3% of the nation's offshore oil and 6% of the nation's offshore gas. So we have one of the smallest reserves of anywhere in the country, according to the best available information. Now the industry has said that's old information. Let us get out there and check it out more, find out, we think there's gonna be more out there. We think there's gonna be more, and that's why we should both be able to do the seismic testing and then also do the drilling out there. With seismic testing, our concern, our position is, why would you be doing it unless you're going to drill in these areas? Yeah. So if you start with the premise of these places are too special to drill, then you also end up at this place of seismic testing just isn't worth the additional harm that we know it's going to cause to marine mammals, to sea turtles, to fisheries, to basically all marine life that relies on sound, which is all marine life. So this is the end of my slides, actually. Yep. So I just wanted to put these up there. I mentioned the 2 things that we were talking about is really science and politics. And what you have started to see, did any of you guys go to the public meetings that we've had on the 5-year hearing? They've been out at the coast, so I certainly don't blame anyone for not making that trip. But the interesting thing we've seen is that as the public has become more educated and engaged in this process, the numbers at these public hearings have gone through the roof. So in North Carolina, we had 2 public meetings sponsored by the federal government. The first was in Wilmington. We had about 400 people show up at that one, and that one was a record at the time. And then the Outer Banks had a hearing. And the Outer Banks had 670 people show up at that public meeting. It was the biggest public meeting that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has ever had. Yes, I've been doing math in various ways, but if you look at all of the public meetings the Bureau has had throughout the Gulf of Mexico, if you look at all the public meetings they've had all over Alaska, none of those places even added all together compared to most of the public hearings we've had down in our region. So the folks in North Carolina are really coming out on this, but really South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia as well. Is that another question?
How would you characterize the opinions of the people in those rooms? Was it mostly pro-drilling or anti-drilling? There were some pro-drilling folks, but it has been overwhelmingly anti-drilling. And when we've talked to the folks from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, they have said that throughout their tour of the Southeast, as they've come around and tried to listen to public opinion, the public opinion is overwhelmingly against it. So I do believe that the federal government is hearing the concerns from the people, and that's a really, really good thing. The question again is how does that fit with the position of the governors? And this is something that is a little bit unclear, and we've been trying to get nailed down a little bit more. What you have in our state especially is a public opinion that is coming out that is directly opposed to the governor's position on this issue. We just had the close of the comment period, as Rob mentioned, and we not only had the governor coming out saying we want drilling in this area, but he said that 50-mile buffer you've got out there that you've proposed is too much. Take it back to 30 miles. You're taking us out of our sweet spot is the term that we've heard from folks over at the state.
that this notion that there are actually very lucrative deposits off the Outer Banks within 50 miles. So some of you in this room may remember this. There was a previous proposal to drill off the Outer Banks. It was in an area called the Point. It was in 1989. Mobil Oil was set. They already had the leases. No one had really thought much about this oil spill stuff. They had the leases. They were getting ready to start doing their exploratory drilling when the Exxon build-outs happened. So that raised a lot of questions and caused folks to slow down and say, we need to look at this a lot more closely because we need to make sure that doesn't happen here. Interestingly, there was a proposed lease sale off of Virginia back in 2010. Same thing happened. Deepwater Horizon occurred, and folks again said, oh wait, no, we don't want that here, actually. So there is precedent for stopping this. There is precedent for stopping this in the Southeast. It is a matter of the folks standing up, getting their talking points together, and making their voices heard to the federal government as well as to the state government. So, I don't want to talk too long, I want to save time for questions. We finished this federal comment period at the end of March. What happens now is the federal government takes everything they received, and from everything we've heard, they've received hundreds of thousands of comments. Again, mostly anti-drilling, but some pro-drilling. And they'll go back and they will put them all together, they'll evaluate everything, and they'll come back out with a new proposed plan. So we're expecting that probably sometime near the end of this year. When they come out with that new proposed plan, y'all are gonna have another opportunity to weigh in. So again, there's a lot of precedent for fighting this off, and there's a lot of that process I pointed out that's still left to go. And this includes even getting us in the plan. So we have at least one more opportunity to weigh in with the federal government to tell them, take us out, we don't want drilling here. But we also have an opportunity during this waiting period where we're waiting for the federal government to come back to talk to the states and the local government. So this is kind of what I started with. There's a need at this point to convey the message to Governor McCrory, to the rest of the folks in Raleigh, to local governments, that this is not consistent with our vision of the state, of the coast, of what we want the North Carolina environment to look like. So even though that comment period is closed, I just want to get the message out there that there's a lot of opportunity for public comment at the federal level as well as at those state and local levels. So we encourage folks to weigh in with your personal stories, what these areas mean to you, how you use them. Economics comes up again and again and again, and economics is really, really important on this. We know the North Carolina coast is incredibly valuable for fishing, for tourism, for all the reasons we go and visit. I've actually talked to one economist about the retirement aspects of the coast and how important that is to the economy. Is there really going to be a retirement economy if it looks like that picture of Port Fourchon? Where you have the industrialized coast. So again, these things that draw people to the area, the natural resources that are so valuable, are really up for grabs in this debate. And it is time for the public to speak up and defend those. Yeah.
Has anything come up? A couple of questions. One, the role of the legislature, in addition to putting pressure on the governor. We are mindful that we're coming into a gubernatorial election in 2016. So those leverage points. And the second is, what kind of economic arguments have they been using, the pro-drilling industry, which is typical of,
Right.
the tar sands, the whole tar sand struggle. And third and finally, is there anything positioned on the opposite side from the Democrats, or one of them has already declared his candidacy? Because that could be an important part of the debate starting now.
Absolutely. So taking this, make sure I don't miss anything in there. So first off, with the state legislature. So this is a federal process. Federal waters go from 3 miles offshore out to 200. So they've proposed this buffer on there, but really the federal government has the ability, they have the right to drill much closer to shore than they've proposed. The state legislature really has no role in that process. The federal government is the decider here. They get to make the decision of what we're going to do with these areas 3 miles offshore and greater. The state does play a role in terms of drilling very close to shore. So if anyone was going to propose drilling in state waters, so there's really close waters in, they could do that. How anyone is going to stand up to the public outcry against drilling within a couple miles of shore is a bigger question to me, but I think there are probably some in the state of North Carolina who would be willing to propose that. Yeah. So we know we have that in the Gulf, for example. There are wells that are very close to shore, so it's possible. But for the most part, we are just dealing with the federal government. We are dealing with the governors. In terms of the coming up election, the 2016 election, Roy Cooper has not staked out a position on this. The Democrats have not staked out a position on this. What we know overall is that in Washington, D.C., there was a letter, I believe in the House of Representatives recently, that had 53 signatories that went to the president that said no drilling on the East Coast, period. And that includes some folks from our region, but it also includes a lot of folks up in the Northeast who are saying, we know oil doesn't know boundaries. We know that there's a risk that if drilling happens, if a spill happens off North Carolina or Virginia, it's going to inch up north. Same thing for Florida. Florida has been against drilling consistently for a very long time, again, because they know their tourism industry relies on it. So those folks have been very strongly against it as well. So again, just our 4 states are the ones who are looking for it. In terms of the economics, the pro-drilling side has a lot of projections about what could happen. So if oil is found, if production occurs, if that industrialization happens, there are lots of those, again, hypothetical, theoretical projections about what that could mean for jobs. Those are hypothetical. They don't exist right now. The oil doesn't exist right now. As we said, it's years and years away. So any of those benefits that are going to come down the line are going to come really far down the line. On the flip side, what we're always looking at is the jobs that exist out there now. Because there are real people with real jobs and real houses and real communities that are out there now that could potentially be put at risk if they conflict with those other uses.
Yes. I was wondering if there was a plan of action in place to visit and inform coastal fishing businesses.
So a lot of folks have been working out on the coast. Surfrider has been very, very active out on the coast. And so folks out there are talking about this. We mentioned the 670 people that showed up at the Outer Banks hearing. Most of those are local folks who are coming out. So I think there's a lot that's been happening on the coast. There's also a lot of resolutions that are out there, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but a lot of local businesses, local business associations, and local governments all up and down the coast in these 4 states are passing resolutions saying this is a bad idea for us. The Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council has passed one of those resolutions and said no drilling, no seismic, this is bad for fishing. Believe it's the Billfish Association has done the same thing. There's a couple of fishing groups that have passed those resolutions. So they are getting engaged.
I guess my question was, is there any grassroots where people are physically going to the fishing businesses and saying, look at this information, this is the statistics, can we do something about this? Informing and educating. I have a lot of contacts in North Carolina, and I'd be willing to volunteer to go to those fishing businesses.
I think that's wonderful. I think anyone who has those personal connections, that's great. As I said, Surfrider's been very active out there. I know the North Carolina Coastal Federation has been really active out there
Have
as
they been
well.
going personally to the business?
I believe so. I believe
That's
so.
my question.
Yeah, I believe so. I'm
Face
not
to face is more effective than
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. No, great. Yeah.
I'm a soldier.
Thank you. Thank you. Right here.
What role will Congress play in this scenario?
Yeah. So, so I mentioned those letters that were going out there. So right now it's really an opportunity just to weigh in with the Obama administration. They have an opportunity to comment like the rest of us do. They will have their own opportunity for comment at the whole end of this process.
That would mean the Congress?
Yes, exactly. Right now, things have been going on in Congress. Every once in a while, there's things that pop up that would try to override the federal government's plan and require drilling in certain places. So those are probably the scariest bills that pop up that say, we're going to scrap this whole process provided for in federal law, and we're just going to require you to drill or to lease everything you possibly can. And those pop up every once in a while, and unfortunately they have been supported by a lot of the Southeast delegation. So that is important mostly in fighting off bad things that could make it worse.
But they could override the Interior Department's decision
Absolutely.
in a bad way.
Yes, they can change the law, they can make this happen if they want it to happen. Yeah.
And is there infrastructure already in the minds of the state?
Well, infrastructure is a great question. It doesn't exist in our area. I mean, as you know, if you spend any time at the coast, it really doesn't exist. And there's a lot of question about where does the oil go when it comes ashore?
Our ports don't support it.
Our ports don't support it, exactly. So this is actually one of the big questions that's outstanding right now is, does North Carolina get any benefits at all? Or is the oil just going to go up to Virginia because their ports can handle it? Or is it going to be that fundamental transformation of the coast that I was talking about? Because it is going to have to be a big, big change to get the pipelines you need, the tanker support that you need, the ports, all of that. So yes, right now, North Carolina doesn't have any of it.
Ships who want to come in, they can't even come in now.
Exactly. So the federal government has done a big study on infrastructure and what it would take. Folks ask about economics. That's one of the things that goes into economics projections. Because they say, oh, we're going to have to build X number of new ports, we're going to have to build all these new roads, all these new pipelines. So that's where those economic figures come from, is again that notion of we're going to industrialize the coast. We're going to turn these areas that we know and love into something that's totally different from what they currently are.
I would like to know if you know, which, if any, sections along the affected coastlines here might see increased potential for damage and which might see reduced potential for damage as a function of the Gulf Stream and other ocean currents.
Interesting. One thing I can speak to, so Gulf Stream generally carries things up along the coast. I'm trying to think of the name of the current that carries it down along the coast.
Labrador.
Thank you. Thank you. Perfect. Yes, I was like, that's right at the tip of my tongue. Yes. So we have a very dynamic environment on the coast. That's just sort of the simple version. Dynamic environment on the coast. One of the places we know is most dynamic is the area right off the Outer Banks. So we know that area is a place of a lot of activity oceanographically, also in terms of weather systems. So short answer to your question is no, I don't know that exactly. But we do believe there's a lot of risk out there, and especially off the coast of North Carolina. When the federal government does its sensitivity analysis, which is one of the things it has to do, it has said that this area of the Southeast United States is one of the most environmentally sensitive places in the country because of the marshes, because of the barrier islands, because of the unique ecosystem that exists here. So we do know all of that if oil did hit the shore, it's going to be a major problem because it's not capable of being cleaned up.
Well, if you take the information about hurricanes, the currents and the winds, Wilmington and Hatteras always get hit.
Yes.
Those are the areas.
Yes.
So if that has any impact,
I think that's
relevant.
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, coming back to Sinsar too, and what she said when she was talking about the Gulf of Mexico is it doesn't take a major oil spill. All it takes is those hurricanes that hit. And she talked about, I think it was 11 million gallons that were spilled during Katrina and Rita, and those weren't considered major oil spills. That was just considered part of what happens when hurricanes come through. So exactly, you have huge damage that comes from weather systems, and in the Gulf there is one platform that's been leaking since I believe it's 2004, and it's not that far offshore, but they don't know how to stop it. Again, hurricane damage. So I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
You know, Louisiana gets an enormous share of its state revenues because of the drilling. And years ago, Florida opted for tourism and Louisiana took the drilling. But for North Carolina to get an economic benefit out of it, does that mean by definition that oil would have to come ashore and you need this huge infrastructure? If they drill 50 miles offshore and take the oil to Virginia, is there any benefit to North Carolina at all, except the risk?
So right now, there is no revenue sharing in any of these 4 states that are on the table. So it will take an act of Congress to change that, to make it even possible to get what Louisiana gets. So right now, everyone talks about revenue sharing a lot, and this is one of the big issues that come up is you talk to coastal communities and they say, we'd love to have some more of that federal money coming down here. We could use that for beach nourishment or anything else. And that's the important thing is it doesn't exist right now. And in fact, I believe there was a state law passed a year or 2 ago that says any money that comes into the state of North Carolina from revenue sharing stays in Raleigh. So it doesn't go out to those coastal communities anyway. So again, you're talking about a lot of the risk, none of the benefit. In these areas, it is unclear whether if that mythical money from revenue sharing ever came to be, again, how does it get divided up? It all has to go into federal law. Does it come in where it's drilled off of? Do we get less because it's so far offshore? Does it go to where the oil is being pumped to? Those are all things that are totally unknown because it doesn't exist right now. Yeah.
Just being very cynical, all they need to do is talk to our legislature. We've learned very quickly how to revenue share in this state.
Just one more back.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One, this gentleman already touched on a little bit, was about the currents. I mean, oil spills along this area that are supposedly far enough away that we're protected. How do they explain away the effects of it against, I mean, that current circles the globe, or circles the whole entire Atlantic. If we have an oil spill here, in Greenland, Newfoundland, England, and all down the coast of Europe, they're going to be being affected by that as well. And that was my first question. My second one is, so what is their answer to that? And number 2 is, we have these protected areas for nurseries and turtles and whales, but how do the whales get to that protected part if they have to swim through the oil-infested waters that are drilling?
Exactly. I mean, those are exactly the types of questions that we need to be asking the federal government right now. For the whales that I had up there, they're so highly endangered that the federal government has previously said if you lose even one, it's likely to cause the extinction of the species.
Wow.
So we have extreme restrictions on fishing and shipping to make sure we're providing protection for these animals, yet you may potentially put oil and gas in the same place where you could have impacts right away. And again, you may have those impacts you know about. If you have a major spill, you may have those chronic low-level impacts that you don't know about. So I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the Gulf of Mexico right now, I think, is the scientists are still out there looking at it. It's 5 years later, the scientists are still trying to figure out where did the oil go? What have the impacts been? Is it still out there? Is it still harmful? We really don't have any idea. The Exxon Valdez, again, was in 1989. The herring fishery that Alaska relies on for so much of its economy still hasn't come back in that area. So again, fundamental changes on the shore. You look at those pictures of those port cities, but fundamental changes in the marine environment as well. And you really don't know nearly as much about what's going on out there and what the long-term effects could be.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I got one more. Back when the 4 governors spoke to the Obama administration, was the Obama administration required to start this process, or did they have a choice?
So they are required under federal law to do 5-year plans. So this 2017 to 2022 plans that is out there, they are required to do that. What goes into that plan is their choice. So I listed all those 8 factors that are up there that are required by law. There's a lot of discretion. Basically, the federal government takes all that information and puts it into a big pot and stirs it up. And they can decide how it comes out. So I think that's a lot of the message, is getting the science in front of them, getting all that information, and then getting the public opinion in front of them to make sure they know that the governors are not speaking for the people. There have been a couple investigative reports over the past year or so that has shown the connection between the oil industry and the governors' associations. So we know there's a very, very tight connection there. Again, it's making clear to the federal government that there's other interests out there, not necessarily being represented by the industry or the governors.
Go ahead, please.
The 18 factors that you talked about.
8, yes.
8.
Yes.
18. I just made it work.
Okay.
Of those factors, are there obviously some that are a lot more important than others that it wouldn't matter if you had maybe 4 of them, but they weren't the right 4 to make that decision?
Under the law, no.
Okay, so
Under
they're all weighted.
under the law, they're supposed to take it all together. They're supposed to make sure they look at every single one of those factors, and there have been cases about that saying, no, you can't skip over some. They're all important. But yes, because there are so many factors, the government does have a lot of discretion. I say science and politics. It's really a political decision. I mean, the science is going to inform the decision, but really there's nothing requiring them to do anything other than the decision that these areas should be off limits. And there was a moratorium on drilling off the east coast of the United States for decades. So I mean, this was something that we had said, no, after Exxon Valdez, we don't want this here. This is just there's too much to risk to have drilling off our coast. Congress lifted the moratorium, the president lifted the moratorium, and now we go through this process every 5 years required by statute. So there are things that could be done to protect the areas, but as of right now, we're just going to be going through this process. I mentioned that the stages, once we come out of that process, if we come out of that process, we're out until the next 5-year cycle. This is the way it works. The federal government refers to it as a whittling down. So if we win it in the next 6 months, we don't think about it again until 2022 or so, which would be really lovely. If we don't win it in the next 6 months, we're going to think about it every step along the way, trying to make sure we're either taken out of the plan or sufficient protections are in place, or how do you fight it, or all of those questions will keep coming up. But again, if you get out once, you're out until that next cycle begins.
Any final questions? Oh, we got one more from Mary.
I have one plug. I have the pleasure of working with Sierra at Southern Rockland Law Center, and one of the things we're working on right now in this little breathing space before the next round of comments is letting Governor McCrory know that he has taken a position that is contrary to how we all feel. So if anybody feels motivated would like to call him today or tomorrow or all of those, his phone number is 919-814-2000. And like Sierra, it's a machine, so you can leave your story or you can say whatever you want to say, but just please express to him that you're opposed to offshore drilling off our coast if you are. Thanks.
And you could let Roy Cooper know that as well, to help him formulate his stance.
Roy Cooper, you bet.
Was it?
I don't know his phone number.
Am I correct that Governor Perdue actually did take some steps in this direction?
Yes, so actually there's a number of North Carolina governors in the past that have taken steps in this direction. So Governor Martin, Perdue, a number of times over the years when oil drilling has come up, they've looked at it and they've said, we don't know enough, we can't guarantee its safety, we don't want drilling here. So again, when we had our meeting in March, we had a lot of the experts come in and talk about the resources, the risks of oil spills. We also had folks who'd been basically on every study committee that's looked at drilling off North Carolina since the 80s. And the questions they said that needed to be answered in 1989, for the most part, still need to be answered. And it has to do about the sensitivity of the resources, the likely risks of spills, what the long-term damage could possibly be. And the answer is, because we've never had drilling in this area, we just don't know.
Okay, we got, well, that gentleman and then Dan. Yes, sir.
The questions that were raised in the 1980s led to a state position that post-oil drilling, exploration well drilling, was inconsistent with the state's coastal management program.
Yep.
And the question would be, is that usable in this negotiation now somehow? And Herb should know since he was involved in that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, coastal consistency absolutely comes into play. And yes, that can be used. A lot of those questions, as you said, are still out there. The information that they wanted to determine coastal consistency still doesn't exist. It comes down in large part to a decision of the state. Right now, we're talking a lot about coastal consistency and seismic. Seismic is moving faster than the drilling stuff is. So there's actually a federal meeting in Wilmington today on seismic, and there is a state Division of Coastal Management meeting in Morehead City on Thursday or Friday, sometime later this week, on the coastal consistency issue for seismic. So this is stuff that is still in play, it's still playing out, and once we get further down the line, if we're still in the plan and are not taken out, it'll come up with regard to drilling as well. So yeah, that's absolutely still an issue.
Great question. Dan, did you want
Just a quick shameless plug. I'm with Dan Crawford, the League of Conservation Voters. May 27th is our annual Green Tie Awards, and Roy Cooper will be the speaker at that. So, maybe a chance for you to corner him and talk to him about this topic on May 27th.
Great. NCLCV.org. I think we've reached the end of our event. Please join me in thanking Sierra for her wonderful presentation. It's clearly evident that we have a lot to learn about this subject, and I hope you all will continue to remain active or get active if you haven't already. And I hope you also will consider joining us 2 weeks from today over at Marbles Kids Museum, where we'll be discussing the question of what's the matter with Kansas and how can North Carolina avoid going down the same road. We'll be hearing from a former state budget director in Kansas, former state lawmaker, the head of the Kansas Center for Economic Development. They're going to come here, tell us about the tax cut mania in Kansas and the rather disastrous impact it's had. And unfortunately, it's a path we seem to be going down here in North Carolina as well. So please join us for that. But Sierra, thank you very much. And look for us online. Spread the word about this event. It'll be on our website in a couple of days. Check it out. See you next time.